The second issue we're talking about today in our special edition of The Cycle, our culture of violence. Have we become completely desensitized to the violence all around us? You might not even notice it anymore.
You're all up in it! It's all up in you! It's 3D, the teeth are deeper, and the explosions are... Oh! Explosion here!
What are you guys doing?
The kitten whispers and tickle fights stop now.
When did video games become so violent and scary?
You see those images on TV all the time, from video games to movies, TV shows, music. Even when we as parents try to shield our kids from images like that, they're exposed to violence on a regular basis. A study from the American Psychological Association found before the age of 18, the average child witnesses over 200,000 violent episodes on TV. So should we really be surprised when our kids act out what they see? Here to provide some insight into our culture of violence is Dr. Stanton Samenow, a clinical psychologist specializing in criminal behavior. Doctor, how are you?
Good afternoon. I'm fine, thank you.
So is someone who is exposed to violence in this way that we are routinely exposed to violence via video games and television more likely to commit violence? And what factors do you think determine a propensity to commit violence?
Well, I don't think that watching violence turns a responsible person into a violent individual. What is critical is not what's on the screen or what's in the video game, but what is in the mind of the viewer or the video game player. This casting about for circumstances outside the individual that allegedly propel him to become something that he wasn't just doesn't even make common sense. It doesn't square with reality.
So let's look at a graph that I found on Kieran Healy's great blog, which shows America at the top there, far more violent. This is assault deaths per 100,000 people in the nation. Not necessarily just gun deaths, but all sorts of violent deaths. And you see through the decades there, America far, far above all the other major nations. And we are trending downward, but we're still an outlier. So America is far more violent than most of the other large nations, all the other large nations in the world. Why is that?
Well, I'm not a sociologist. I deal with offenders. I've spent 42 years interviewing offenders from practically every demographic background. And quite frankly, again, it is true that for people who commit acts of violence, they're drawn to violence. They're fascinated by violence. But to say that watching violence made them that way is a complete and total stretch.
Yeah, Dr. Samenow, I have to agree. It feels like we're trying to cast blame in misguided places. It's understandable when you try to make sense of such an inexplicable tragedy. But when I think about cultures of violence, I think about the 12-year-old child soldier in Somalia and, kids who've grown up in totalitarian regimes who are exposed to actual violence on a day-to-day basis and not our culture of video games and movies.
Well, that's right. In countries like that, people are co-opted to become soldiers. They're forced to become violent. In our society, nobody is forced to become violent. So it's a totally different culture. People make choices.
And Doctor, to your point, I don't find either a link between video game consumption, for example, and rates of violent crime. If we could put up this chart that I was looking at earlier, shows the United States as an outlier overall in terms of violent crime, but absolutely no correlation between high video game consumption and violent crime, gun-related murders, this particular chart is. But so we don't see a link overall between violent content. It's not going to turn a normal individual into a killer. But could it serve as a trigger for someone who is already mentally disturbed?
Well, if you're talking about copycat crimes, they do occur, meaning, let's say that millions of people watch a particular movie. Well, most of those people, the movie is just entertainment. They don't even think about it afterwards, or they may talk about the movie, but they wouldn't dream of enacting what they see. But if you have a person who already is fascinated by violence and who can't get enough of it, yes, there are copycat crimes, but for every person who enacts that which he sees in the movies or on television, there are millions, probably tens of millions, that watch the very same show, play the very same game, but for them, it was just entertainment.
Yeah, Doctor, I mean, I totally get that point. The vast majority of people who watch violence on television and the movies aren't going to go out there and say they want to do it themselves. But if there is an issue with people who have maybe violent tendencies, as you say, a fascination with violence, and this could serve as something that sets them off, this could serve as a source of inspiration for them, isn't that something we should be concerned about and try to deal with some way? Or are you just basically saying, hey, we got to live with that if 1 out of every 10 million goes and starts shooting places up?
Well, unless you want to start imposing censorship on a pretty wide scale, I would say, yeah. I mean, we don't know who's going to watch a program and copy what he sees. But last night I went to the movies. I saw 6 previews. 5 of those previews contained very violent episodes. So what are we going to do? Have no more violent movies? Have no more violence in television? I mean, it's not a reasonable thing to even talk about.
Okay. Dr. Samenow, thank you very much. Next, a key part of this we don't often like to talk about in America, mental health. Our special coverage of the shooting at Sandy Hook continues.